Today on CityCast Madison. Madison has a projected $27 million deficit for next year's budget. So what's being done? The city's hosting public engagement events on each side of town to hear your priorities, including one tonight. So in the midst of these conversations on budget priorities, we wanted to know, how the heck did we get here? And what are our best options for getting out? Who better to ask than our own city finance director, Dave Schmiedicke? It's Wednesday, May 29th. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Dave, hello.
Hello.
So, we had you on the podcast last October to talk about our city's 2024 budget,
right.
The how and why we needed to tighten our belt for this year's budget. And you had said then that 2025 is going to be a whole new ballgame, and it certainly is. We're here. How is the process going?
Well, we've really been trying to engage the council as well as residents regarding this issue. We started back in January developing an information series. That then, we put that all together. We then had a number of briefings of the council in February and March. The council met and discussed sort of their values and priorities relative to city services, and adopted a resolution that set forth some guiding principles for developing the 2025 budget and beyond. This idea of we need to look at not only the upcoming year, but future years.
I understand the city's faced a budget shortfall of some degree every year for 14 years. Why is this 2025 cycle so different?
It really comes down to the state. The state legislature, state law really limits, for all cities in Wisconsin, the amount of revenue that they can have, and they force a heavy reliance on property taxes for cities. And throughout that 14 years, our revenues don't grow at the same rate as our basic costs to keep current programs going. The pandemic really affected the amount of revenues that the city received. That limited array of revenues, the amount slowed down considerably. And we don't have the types of revenues that can kind of capture the economic growth that's happened over the last few years. So we don't have a sales tax. We don't have an income tax. That's all collected at the state level and is supposed to be shared with local governments. And there was a large increase in shared revenue from the state in the most recent state budget, but Madison got the lowest amount per capita. And the state legislature kind of went out of their way to make sure that Madison did not receive a share of the budget, a share of that increase. It got a smaller share than any other city around the state.
And it definitely felt political, is what I understand. That move.
I won't get into that, but I think it's definitely the formula for distributing this new money was set up in such a way that disadvantaged Madison.
And I want to touch on the news recently, because this year we actually ended up with a city budget surplus. How did that happen? I know some people are thinking that means this fixes our deficit, right? We're all set.
Yeah, the city, we finished the 2023, so the year that ended December 31st, 2023, with a surplus, a little over $30 million. That's good news, but it's really one-time effects. So we have had a rapid increase in the city's investment income. So we have cash balances, cash that we don't need throughout the year. We invest in short-term, maybe treasury type notes, other types of short-term investments. And the interest rate that we were generating on that went from about 0.25% during 2021, sort of the depth of the COVID effects on the economy, to about 4% in 2023. So that was a large increase, and that's where all the revenue came from. That combined with agencies had a lot of underspending relative to budget. And most of that is due to sort of turnover in positions throughout the year. We've had a lot of departures and new hires. And then relative to the budget we set up, we may have budgeted for a position at a certain pay level, somebody who may have been here for years, they retired, and then we hire somebody lower on the pay scale. And that generated some of the savings. We've built a lot of that into the 2024 budget. So we've taken an across-the-board cut to agencies. We've increased the savings from that staff turnover that's happening. So what happened in 2023, we really expect to be a one-time effect. It's definitely helped our rainy day fund, but it doesn't help this sort of ongoing long-term issue with our costs versus the allowable revenues under state law.
Yeah, and can you unpack that a little bit more about how that disparity is going on outside of this kind of one-time situation?
Yeah, that's great. So we're projecting for 2025 that difference between our ongoing revenues allowed under state law and our cost to continue current programs is about a $27 million gap deficit.
Okay, that's where the deficit comes from.
That's where the deficit comes from. And then when we look out 5 years from now, that could be as much, it's a total of $60 million if we don't do anything, which means that would basically use up large amounts of our rainy day fund. And we just have a bigger problem if we don't address it. Typically that gap, the 27 million in past years, has maybe been 5-10 million or so. We've been able to address it through a number of measures. Things like increases in existing fees, like building permits and ambulance fees. We've restructured health insurance costs for employees, where employees pay more for their health insurance. We've made other efficiencies on the spending side. We've put into place new what are called special charges for urban forestry and resource recovery or recycling type programs. So a number of measures have been put in place. It's just the magnitude of what we're facing now is just a lot larger than what we faced in the past.
Yeah, it's just not going to cut it anymore.
Right. Or we have to do, big changes, whether it's reductions in services or larger increases in revenues. And really the only revenue that we have that's a major revenue is the property tax, because of the way that the state legislature has set up that structure for cities in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and I think earlier when I was talking about politics, I was thinking about any possibility. It doesn't seem, would you say that there's an outlook for the city going to the state and saying, hey, we're in this situation. Can you help us open up some of these revenue generating sources? I'm pretty sure they did something like that for Milwaukee, but they're not necessarily the same sort of circumstances. So maybe that's a little bit of a bad comparison, but is there any space there that the state would say, hey, Madison, it looks like you're in trouble. Let's work this out.
I would say that the city has tried to do that for many years. It's not been received by the legislature at all. Governor Evers, in his last couple of budgets, has proposed a 0.5-cent sales tax for Wisconsin cities, which is the same amount that Wisconsin counties are able to levy. And that was rejected by the legislature. You're right, Milwaukee was able to get a 2% sales tax adopted for the city in the most recent budget. They are facing much, much deeper financial challenges than any other city in the state, including Madison. They have their own pension system where they have very large unfunded pension liabilities. And they were looking at 30 to 40% reductions in service in terms of police, fire, other city services. And so it really was, a big push by the city itself, by its police and fire unions, and so on. And I think, the understanding was, look, we can't have the state's largest city basically fail.
That's steep, 30 to 40%. And we're facing possibly We just recently spoke to the Common Council president, Jeanette Figueroa Cole, last week, saying up to maybe 15% in services. Let's talk about what's going on here in Madison in terms of what our next steps are. And you mentioned kind of these bigger swings that would have to happen, bigger changes. When we talked to the Common Council president, we talked about the two major tactics that we understand the city's looking at. First is the referendum to raise property taxes, and the second is to cut services, and somewhere in between, maybe two of them, some in tandem. Can you talk about the pros and cons of each of those tactics?
Sure. I think it really is kind of, when you get right down to it, absolutely right. Is it more revenues or less expenditures or some kind of combination of the two? With the revenues, I think obviously you have to think about affordability when you talk about that for residents, for property taxpayers. You also have to think about equity. So sort of large increases in fees, for example, tend to be a little what we call more regressive, meaning a little less fair for those of lower income, as opposed to the property tax, which nobody really likes, but it is a percentage tax rate as opposed to a flat fee if we were to increase fees. So there's an equity question there.
Yeah, so meaning people who make more, that would be taken into account versus everyone pays the same.
Exactly, right. And then on the expenditure side, we can reduce services, but that has some equity effects as well that have to be considered. But it could be things like, how many library branches do we have, for example, or how often do we pick up the trash? At what point do we plow the snow? How many park shelters are open throughout the year? I mean, those are the types of things we'll have to think about in terms of the level of services that city residents have come to expect, sort of the outcomes that they expect from the services that they receive. And that's the balancing of affordability and equity from a cost of government, cost of services versus how many services residents want to receive and that level of services every day.
This will be on the ballot likely in November, I'm imagining, about a possible referendum. How much money are people agreeing to if they say, yes, we want this property tax hike because we don't want to cut city services?
That will require some action by the council. They'll have to adopt a resolution to put that question on the ballot. If $27 million, let's just pick that number, is added to the property tax, that's about $285 on the average value home. And the average value home in the city is around a little over $400,000 in value. And that's about an additional 4% or so on the total tax bill. And just a reminder for those listening to the podcast, that when you get your property tax bill, the city portion of that is about a third of the bill. About half of the bill is Madison schools. And then the remainder, about 15% or so, is the county. The county's about 12%. The remaining 2 to 3% is the technical college, Madison College.
Yeah. I appreciate that breakdown. And the alternative, you mentioned some of these. I want to hear a little bit more about the services that might be vulnerable to getting cut or possibly even axed altogether. It was like city jobs. It sounds like if the referendum doesn't pass, there's going to be cuts across the board.
That's a possibility. When we look at, again, 27 million, that's roughly equivalent to 270 positions in the city. That's roughly equivalent to the department in the city that does all the snow plowing and picking up the trash. That's the 27 million is roughly the size of the budget for that agency. Our entire budget for library branches, all of the library activities, is $20 million. So it gives you a sense of the size of this and what could happen with city employees and positions, possible layoffs, things like that that could occur. Obviously, we're not going to eliminate an entire department or anything like that. It would probably be more looking at what sort of services, the level of services provided by the police department. How many fire stations do we have? So, for example, a fire station costs around $1 million a year or so to staff on average, some more, some less. So those are some examples of what could be impacted by this. Again, we're not at a point of saying what will or won't happen, but those are some sort of examples of costs of services.
Okay. And actually, now, as we're talking, it's occurring to me, I didn't ask how likely will it be that the Common Council puts forward this referendum at this point? Because I got the impression that that's kind of the leaning towards that because of how much cutting would be required without that sort of measure. Where are we on that?
We'll be talking with the council over their next few meetings. A first step is to kind of update our cost to continue. We've been working on that with agencies over the last couple of months. Like, what is the actual cost to keep current service levels, to pay employees, to be sure we have enough for employee benefits, all those things. And so we'll be talking with the council about that in June into July. And then included with that will be probably some options around, okay, do you want to look at property tax referendum? Do you want to look at possible other revenue options? And then what sort of reductions what would you want to make? That'll ultimately lead to the council having to make a decision by no later than its meeting in early August on whether or not to proceed with a referendum question on the November ballot.
So you're gathering all the data right now,
Yep.
and you're so you have the full picture and you can make the most informed choice.
Yep.
But I'm just curious. I mean, you guys are engaging the public around this property tax referendum question. Do you guys have any sense what the sentiments are on the ground so far? Like, what people warm to the idea, cold? I don't mean to be reductive, but me on this side, I feel worried about a possible outcome where, the city has to face so many cuts.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a couple of community meetings this month. We've got a couple this week and one next week. I think I would say people are engaged. They're interested in understanding the issues. I think there's concern on both sides. You talk about services, people talk about the services that they feel are important to them. And I think there's a lot of appreciation from what I've heard of the level of services in Madison and the value I think people feel they get for the taxes that they pay. I think on the flip side, there's a lot of challenges with what's happening with home values, increases in assessed values, what that might mean for property taxes paid. And I think, that I think translates into how much more can we really pay on the property tax. And so I think it's really a difficult issue there. With all of that, obviously meetings like this bring out, folks who are motivated to talk about certain things. So I think we're just going to have to see. I think, like I said, services are really important to folks, but also affordability is a key question too. So,
yeah. That's an equally legitimate concern.
Right.
Looking at all of this, when you think about Madison and walking down the streets, it just feels like it's booming, it's buzzing, it's full of economic activity. The construction is out, our economy is strong. And it's like, but we're in a deficit. What do you mean? Yeah. What's going on?
Yeah, no, that sentiment's expressed by a lot of folks. It's like, well, I'm paying more in property taxes. Where does that money go? And it really comes back to the state legislature, these state law limits. When we talk about limits on property taxes, the formula for all of that really means that the property tax revenues can go up about 2% or so a year to pay for the cost of services, the cost of operations in the city. And inflation's been 3, 4, 5%. It's been coming back down, but really those costs are going up faster than the revenues are going up. And then when the state legislature had a chance to give more money back to cities, it chose not to give much to Madison. And so all of these factors coming together means that, yes, we see all of the economic activity in Madison, but that doesn't mean we get more revenues as a result of it because of the way the state and the legislature sets up the revenue structure for the city and how it distributes state aid to the city.
So a lot of it's just not even coming to us.
Right.
Our city's growing, so we have more people to take care of too.
Right.
If our city finds our way through this budget question for 2025, might we find ourselves in the same sort of position in the following years? What's the outlook?
Yeah, I mean, the outlook's not great, and it's not like these issues go away, but we do have a much larger deficit than we've had in previous years. So that's why we talk a lot about, we need kind of ongoing solutions, whether it's an increase in the property tax through a referendum or through some other fee, or a permanent reduction in costs, meaning we have to stop doing certain things and certain services. That's how we kind of address this in the long term. But even so, unless things change in the future, such as some change in state aid formulas or change in like sales tax, what we can actually collect at the local level, we still have the imbalance won't be as much, but it'll still be some challenges out into the future.
Last question. What's most on your mind right now, like as this process moves forward? Like what's got your attention most?
I think just making sure that we're doing all we can to inform the council and inform residents about how the city budget works, what city services are, how they're paid for, and really being transparent about, this is what the current situation looks like and what the future looks like, and these are your options. And really trying to get to that decision of how do we move forward on this. So those are the things I'm thinking about a lot.
Well, Dave, we appreciate you so much. Thank you for taking the time to educate us and give us the skinny. We super, super appreciate it.
No, you're welcome. Thanks for your time today.
That's Dave Schmiedicke, the city's director of finance. As discussed, the city's feedback engagement events continue on this week and next. There's one tonight for the Southside and near Westside residents at the Village on Park on South Park Street. And there's one tomorrow at the Madison Municipal Building downtown for the Central Madison residents. FYI, that one also has a virtual attendance option. The city is strongly encouraging pre-registration. To find registration and more details on the upcoming events, head to our show notes for a link. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone you know who can make it make sense? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, be balanced.